The Colorado Territory in 1882 was a land where secrets grew as tall as the pine trees and twice as dark. In those days, when a woman traveled alone with nothing but a worn leather suitcase and shadows in her eyes, folks knew better than to ask. Too many questions. But some secrets have a way of demanding answers, especially when they collide with a man who sees through pretenses like morning mist through mountain peaks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, though that wasn't the name sewn into the clothing in her suitcase. She was a woman running from a past that chased her across 3 states and toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. When she stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Cedar Falls on that scorching July morning, she had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed new life would unravel the moment she met Jake Morgan, a cowboy with healing hands and an unsettling ability to read the truth written in a person's posture. What happened next would shake the foundations of a quiet mountain town and prove that sometimes the most dangerous wounds are the ones that never show on the surface. But perhaps the most remarkable part wasn't how one woman's arrival changed everything, or even how a cowboy's simple proposition would challenge everything she believed about trust and survival. The real story lies in how a community learned that healing sometimes requires breaking open first, and that the strongest bonds are forged not in perfection, but in the honest acknowledgement of our deepest scars. The morning stagecoach wheezed to a stop outside Henderson's General Store, like an old man finally catching his breath after climbing a mountain. Dust swirled around the wooden wheels as they settled into the familiar ruts that marked Cedar Falls' main thoroughfare. Inside the store, Mary Henderson looked up from her inventory ledger, squinting through the grimy window at the lone passenger stepping down from the coach. The woman who emerged was neither young nor old, with auburn hair pinned severely back, and a traveling dress that had seen better days but was meticulously clean. She moved with purpose, declining the driver's offer to help with her luggage, instead lifting a single brown leather suitcase with both hands. The case appeared heavy, requiring her to shift her grip twice before she managed to hoist it properly. What caught Mary's attention wasn't the woman's appearance, which was unremarkable enough for the frontier, but the way her eyes swept the street in a single practiced motion, cataloging every doorway, every window, every potential escape route. Frank Riley wiped down glasses at the Silver Dollar Saloon, watching through his establishment's swinging doors as the stranger paused outside Henderson's store. Something about her stillness reminded him of the way deer froze when they sensed a predator nearby. She stood there for nearly a full minute, that heavy suitcase weighing down her right arm, before pushing through the store's front door with more force than necessary. Inside Henderson's, the woman approached the counter with measured steps. Mary noticed that despite the heat and dust of travel, the newcomer's breathing was controlled, steady. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the crisp consonants of Eastern education tempered by something else, something careful. "I'm looking for work," she said without preamble. "Seamstress work, mending, alterations. I can also help with medical needs if anyone requires assistance." Mary set down her pencil, studying the woman's face. The stranger's hands rested on the counter, and Mary couldn't help but notice how clean they were despite the journey, with short, practical nails and small calluses that suggested skilled work. But there were other details that didn't quite fit. A thin white scar along her left wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, and the way she positioned herself to keep the door in her peripheral vision. "Medical needs?" Mary asked, genuine curiosity overtaking frontier politeness. "You have training in that area?" "Some experience with battlefield medicine," the woman replied, then seemed to catch herself. "I mean, I've helped with difficult births, set bones, that sort of thing." Many seamstresses learn basic medical skills when traveling. The clarification came too quickly, Mary thought, but she nodded anyway. Cedar Falls had been without a proper seamstress since old Mrs. Patterson passed the previous winter, and Dr. Emma Carson was overworked treating everything from mining accidents to childhood fevers. The town could use both skills. Name's Mary Henderson. This is my store. She extended a hand across the counter. And you are? Sarah Mitchell. The handshake was firm, perhaps too firm, as if the woman was consciously remembering to match the expected strength for her apparent profession. Well, Miss Mitchell, I think we might be able to help each other. Mrs. Thompson has been asking about finding someone to help with sewing, and Dr. Carson mentioned she could use assistance with her patients. Where are you planning to stay? Sarah's eyes flicked toward her suitcase, and Mary caught the brief tightening around her mouth. I was hoping to find boarding arrangements. Somewhere quiet, if possible. The Frontier Inn is decent enough, though it can get loud when the miners come down from the mountains on Saturday nights. Mrs. Thompson might have space in her boarding house. She's particular about her tenants, but she appreciates useful skills. As if summoned by their conversation, the door chimed again, and Grace Thompson entered, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the morning heat. Grace was Cedar Falls' unofficial ambassador for newcomers, a role she'd assumed after losing her husband to a mine collapse 5 years earlier. She possessed an uncanny ability to size up strangers and had never been wrong about someone's character, a fact that made her both respected and slightly feared among the townspeople. Mary, dear, I need more thread for the church altar cloths, Grace began, then noticed Sarah. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had a customer. Actually, Grace, this is Miss Sarah Mitchell. She's looking for work as a seamstress and boarding arrangements. Miss Mitchell, this is Mrs. Grace Thompson. Grace's sharp blue eyes took in every detail of Sarah's appearance with the thoroughness of a military inspection. She noted the quality of the stitching on Sarah's dress, the way she held herself, the slight wariness that suggested someone accustomed to looking over her shoulder. When her gaze fell on the heavy suitcase, Grace's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Seamstress work, you say? What's your experience? I've worked in Boston, primarily alterations and custom pieces for ladies of society. Sarah's pause was so brief that Mary missed it entirely, but Grace caught the hesitation. Boston's quite a journey from our little mountain town. What brings you to Cedar Falls specifically? The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated stove. Sarah's hands moved almost involuntarily to smooth her skirt, a gesture Grace recognized as someone buying time to formulate an answer. I wanted a change of scenery. The city became overwhelming. Grace nodded, as if this explanation satisfied her completely, though her eyes never left Sarah's face. Well, change of scenery we certainly offer. I do have a room available in my boarding house. It's quiet, clean, and comes with 2 meals a day. The rate is fair, and I provide laundry services. Would you like to see it? Relief flickered across Sarah's features so quickly that only Grace noticed it. That would be very kind, Mrs. Thompson. Excellent. Mary, I'll take that thread in blue and white. Miss Mitchell, would you mind terribly if we stopped by Dr. Carson's office on our way to the boarding house? She mentioned yesterday that she's been struggling with some torn bandages, and if you truly have medical experience, perhaps you could help. The walk to Dr. Carson's office took them past the heart of Cedar Falls business district. Sarah observed everything with the same systematic attention she'd shown at the stagecoach, noting the layout of streets, the location of the sheriff's office, the number of horses tied outside the saloon. Grace kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out various establishments and their proprietors, but she was equally busy making her own observations. Dr. Emma Carson's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building, with living quarters upstairs. The space was cramped but scrupulously clean, smelling of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Emma herself was a compact woman in her 30s, with prematurely gray hair and hands stained by years of medical work. She looked up from organizing supplies. As Grace knocked on the open door, "Grace, perfect timing. I was just wondering if I should try to stitch these bandages myself or admit defeat and order new ones from Denver." Emma's voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent too many nights talking worried families through medical crises. "Actually, I may have a solution. Dr. Carson, meet Miss Sarah Mitchell. She's new to town and claims experience with both seamstress work and medical assistance." Emma's professional interest was immediately evident. She dried her hands on a clean towel and approached Sarah with the direct manner of someone accustomed to making quick assessments. "Medical experience? What kind?" "Field medicine primarily. Treating wounds, setting bones, assisting with surgeries when necessary." Sarah's voice carried more confidence when discussing medical matters, Grace noted. "Field medicine suggests military or emergency situations. Were you involved in the war?" The question struck Sarah like a physical blow. Her composure wavered for just an instant, but it was enough for both women to notice. I assisted where I could." Many women found ways to help during those difficult times. Emma exchanged a meaningful look with Grace. The war had ended 17 years ago, but its effects still rippled through communities across the country. Many people carried scars, both visible and hidden, from those years. "Well, regardless of where you learned, we could certainly use the help. Would you mind looking at these bandages? I'm afraid my stitching skills are better suited to human flesh than fabric." Sarah set down her suitcase and examined the torn bandages with hands that moved with practiced efficiency. She turned the fabric, testing the weave, examining the tears with the thoroughness of someone who understood that poor materials could mean the difference between recovery and infection. "These can be salvaged," she said after a moment. "The tears are clean, and the fabric is still strong. With proper stitching and reinforcement, they'll serve well enough until you can order replacements." "Wonderful. Could you show me the technique? I'm always eager to learn new skills." As Sarah worked, demonstrating a complex stitching pattern that would distribute stress across the repaired areas, both Emma and Grace observed her with growing interest. Her hands moved with the confidence of extensive experience, and her explanations revealed a depth of knowledge that went far beyond basic frontier medicine. "This particular stitch is useful for battlefield conditions," Sarah explained, then caught herself again. "I mean, for any situation where durability is more important than appearance." Emma nodded, but made a mental note of the slip. Between the medical knowledge and the repeated references to battlefield conditions, she was beginning to form theories about their mysterious newcomer's background. The afternoon was growing late when Grace finally led Sarah to the boarding house, a tidy 2-story structure painted white with blue trim. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The building sat on a quiet side street, surrounded by a garden that showed Grace's careful attention. The room she showed Sarah was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the mountains. "Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6, Grace explained as Sarah set her suitcase on the bed. "Laundry day is Wednesday. I ask that my tenants keep regular hours and avoid entertaining visitors in their rooms. Will that arrangement suit you?" "Very much so." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. One more thing, dear." Grace paused in the doorway, her voice taking on a gentler tone. Cedar Falls is a small town, but it's also a place where people can start over if they need to. Whatever brought you here, you'll find folks here mind their own business as long as you're not causing trouble. After Grace left, Sarah sat on the bed and opened her suitcase for the first time since arriving. The contents were carefully packed: several sets of practical clothing, sewing supplies, a substantial amount of cash hidden in a false bottom, And nestled beneath everything else, a small leather pouch containing medical instruments that would have been valuable in any frontier settlement. She also removed a daguerreotype of two young women standing beside a garden gate. One was clearly Sarah herself, though younger and with longer hair. The other woman shared her features but carried herself with a different energy, a brightness that seemed to illuminate the photograph despite its formal composition. Sarah traced the second woman's face with one finger before placing the photograph on the washstand. That evening, she joined Grace and the two other boarders for dinner. Mr. Peterson, the town blacksmith, and Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow who took in washing. The conversation was pleasant and undemanding, focusing on local events and the weather. Sarah contributed little, but she listened carefully, absorbing information about the town's routines, its problems, and its people. It was during this dinner that she first heard Jake Morgan's name mentioned. "Speaking of injuries," Mrs. Rodriguez was saying, "that new horse of Jake Morgan's threw young Billy Crawford yesterday. Jake set the boy's arm himself before Dr. Carson could even be fetched. Billy said it barely hurt at all." "Jake has a gift for healing," Grace agreed. "His grandmother was part Cherokee, and she taught him things about medicine that most doctors never learn. The man can cure anything from a broken bone to a broken heart, though he's had less success with the latter in his own case." Mr. Peterson chuckled. "Half the unmarried women in 3 counties have tried to catch Jake's attention. He's polite enough, but he's never shown serious interest in settling down. Some say he's too particular. Others think he's nursing a broken heart from back east." Sarah filed this information away with everything else she was learning about. Cedar Falls. A man with medical knowledge and healing abilities might prove useful, depending on what challenges lay ahead. She had no way of knowing, as she prepared for her first night in the mountain town, that Jake Morgan would soon challenge every carefully constructed defense she'd built around her secrets. The next morning dawned clear and crisp with the kind of mountain air that seemed to wash the world clean. Sarah woke before sunrise, a habit developed during years when early rising meant the difference between safety and capture. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs, hoping to explore the town before the day's activities began. She found Grace already in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the steady rhythm of long practice. "Early riser, I see," Grace observed. Without looking up, "Coffee's on the stove. Help yourself." Sarah poured a cup and stood by the window, watching the town slowly come to life. A few early merchants were opening their shops, and she could see smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge, where Mr. Peterson was already at work. "Mrs. Thompson," she began carefully, "yesterday you mentioned that Dr. Carson might need assistance. Would it be appropriate for me to offer my services?" Grace's hands never paused in their work, but Sarah caught the slight smile that crossed her face. "I think Emma would be delighted. She's been working herself to exhaustion since Dr. Williams' retired last year. Having someone with medical knowledge would be a godsend. And the seamstress work? Start with Emma. Word travels fast in a small town. If you do good work, you'll have more customers than you can handle within a week." As if to prove Grace's point, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew both women to the window. A rider was approaching at considerable speed, and even from a distance, they could see him swaying in the saddle. "That's Tom Bradley," Grace said, concern evident in her voice. "Our sheriff." "Something's wrong." They watched as Sheriff Bradley pulled up in front of Dr. Carson's office and half fell from his horse. Even from their distance, they could see the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Gunshot," Sarah said with certainty, already moving toward the door. "He's losing blood fast." Grace caught her arm. "Sarah, wait." "You don't want to. People die when you wait," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a new authority that stopped Grace's protests. "Dr. Carson will need help, and she need it now." Without another word, Sarah ran from the boarding house toward The medical office, her careful facade cracking to reveal someone accustomed to medical emergencies. Grace watched her go, recognizing in that moment that their mysterious seamstress carried secrets far more complex than a simple desire for a change of scenery. The real story of Sarah Mitchell was about to begin, though neither she nor the town of Cedar Falls was prepared for what would unfold when her carefully hidden past collided with the present she was trying to build. Sheriff Tom Bradley collapsed against Dr. Carson's doorframe just as Sarah reached the medical office. Blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his left shoulder, and his face had taken on the grayish pallor that Sarah recognized as the early stages of shock. Emma Carson appeared in the doorway, took one look at her patient, and immediately began issuing instructions. "Help me get him inside," Emma said, supporting Bradley's right side while Sarah took his left. "Table in the back room. Mind the shoulder." As they maneuvered the injured sheriff through the narrow doorway, Sarah automatically began her assessment. The wound was high on the shoulder, likely missing major arteries based on the bleeding pattern, but the bullet was still lodged inside. Bradley's breathing was labored but steady, and his pupils responded normally to the changing light as they moved him from the bright morning sun into the dim interior of the medical office. "What happened, Tom?" Emma asked as they settled him. "Onto the examination table." "Claim jumpers," Bradley gasped between breaths. "Up at Widow's Creek, 3 of them, maybe 4. Got the drop on me when I went to investigate the reports." Sarah was already examining the wound with practiced hands, her fingers probing gently around the entry point. "The bullets lodged against the shoulder blade," she reported to Emma. "No arterial damage, but we need to extract it soon before infection sets in." Emma paused in gathering her surgical instruments. "How can you tell all that just by touch?" The question hung in the air as Sarah realized she'd revealed more medical knowledge than any traveling seamstress should possess. She could feel both Emma and Sheriff Bradley studying her face, waiting for an explanation that wouldn't compromise the careful identity she'd constructed. "I've seen this type of wound before," she said carefully. "During the war, many women learned field surgery out of necessity." "The war ended 17 years ago," Emma pointed out. "You would have been quite young." Before Sarah could respond, Sheriff Bradley groaned as another wave of pain hit him. The conversation about her background would have to wait. Emma handed Sarah a bottle of carbolic acid and clean cloths while she prepared her surgical tools. "Can you assist with the extraction?" Emma asked. "I'll need someone to hold him steady and manage the bleeding." Sarah nodded, falling into the familiar rhythm of surgical assistance. As Emma worked to remove the bullet, Sarah anticipated each need, passing instruments before they were requested and applying pressure at exactly the right moments. Her hands moved with the confidence of extensive experience, and her calm presence seemed to ease both the patient's anxiety and Emma's concentration. The bullet extraction took nearly an hour. When Emma finally dropped the lead slug into a metal basin with a satisfying clink, Sheriff Bradley was unconscious from the combination of pain and blood loss, but his breathing had stabilized and the bleeding was under control. "Excellent work," Emma said, washing her hands in a basin of clean water. "I couldn't have managed that extraction alone, not with the angle the bullet took. Where did you really learn surgical assistance like that?" Sarah was cleaning her own hands, buying time to formulate an answer that would satisfy Emma's curiosity without revealing too much truth. "I worked with a doctor in Boston who specialized in treating veterans. Many of them suffered from old war wounds that required surgical intervention." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it omitted crucial details about the circumstances under which she'd gained her medical knowledge. Emma seemed to accept the explanation, but Sarah caught the thoughtful look in the doctor's eyes that suggested further questions would come later. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see several townspeople gathering in the street, their voices raised in animated discussion. Grace Thompson appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from hurrying. Emma dear, is Tom going to be all right? The whole town's heard about the shooting. He'll recover, Emma assured her, thanks largely to Miss Mitchell's assistance. I've never had such capable help during surgery. Grace's sharp eyes moved from the unconscious sheriff to Sarah, who was still cleaning surgical instruments with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to post-operative procedures. Miss Mitchell, you mentioned medical experience yesterday, but I'm beginning to think you understated your qualifications. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention back to the window. A lone rider was approaching at a controlled gallop, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Even from a distance, there was something about his bearing that commanded attention. That's Jake. Morgan, Grace said. Someone must have sent word about Tom's condition. Sarah watched through the window as the rider dismounted outside the medical office. Jake Morgan was tall and lean, with dark hair that showed sun-bleached highlights, and the kind of deep tan that came from working outdoors in all weather. He moved with deliberate purpose as he tied his horse to the hitching post, but there was also a careful awareness in the way he scanned the gathered crowd that reminded Sarah of her own habitual caution. When Jake entered the medical office, he brought with him the sense of leather, horses, and mountain air. His eyes immediately went to Sheriff Bradley, taking in the bandaged shoulder and the patient's unconscious state with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating injuries. How bad? He asked Emma, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested someone more comfortable with silence than conversation. Bullets out. Bleeding stopped. He'll need rest and careful monitoring, but he should make a full recovery. Jake's attention shifted to Sarah, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical presence. Jake Morgan's eyes were an unusual shade of green like deep forest shadows, and they held a perceptiveness that felt intrusive. When his gaze dropped to Sarah's hands, still faintly stained with Sheriff Bradley's blood despite her scrubbing, his expression shifted just slightly. You helped with the surgery? He asked her directly. Miss Mitchell was indispensable, Emma answered before Sarah could. I couldn't have managed the extraction without her. Jake kept his attention on Sarah, his scrutiny sharp enough to make her skin prickle. She had the strange sense he was studying her, the same way she'd once studied the streets of unfamiliar towns, cataloging everything for threat or value. Jake has a solid foundation in medicine himself, Grace offered, trying to ease the silence. His grandmother passed down healing traditions that go hand in hand with Emma's formal training. Between them, they've kept this town in remarkable health. My grandmother taught natural remedies and preventive care, Jake said, still watching Sarah. Surgery's another matter. That takes battlefield experience or formal training under extreme pressure. His comment wasn't overtly accusatory, but the subtext was hard to miss. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Medical knowledge comes from many sources, Mr. Morgan. Not all of them involve a uniform, Jake nodded. True, but some backgrounds leave traces, the way you handled those tools, how you moved during the operation, how fast you responded to Dr. Carson. It suggests training under pressure. The kind where hesitation means someone dies. Before she could answer, Sheriff Bradley stirred with a low groan, drawing everyone's attention. The tension in the room diffused slightly. Tom, how are you feeling? Emma asked gently, checking his vitals. Like I've been shot, he muttered, trying to smile. But better than I should, thanks to you all. Those claim jumpers still at Widow's Creek. I'll take care of them, Jake said without hesitation. This is my responsibility, Bradley protested, struggling to rise. I can't ask. You're not, Jake cut in. I'm offering. Widow's Creek is closer to my land than town anyway. Sarah found herself speaking before thinking. They won't hesitate to shoot if they feel cornered. If you're going alone, you should take medical supplies just in case. Jake looked at her again, and this time there was something different in his expression, Curiosity maybe, or calculation. Are you offering to put those together, Miss Mitchell? I can assemble a basic kit, she said carefully. Bandages, antiseptic, sutures. Nothing too complicated. That's very considerate, Emma said warmly. Though let's hope he doesn't need it. Best to be prepared, Jake replied, eyes still locked on Sarah. Experience teaches caution. It does, she said softly. Grace, who had been watching the exchange with sharp interest, stepped forward. Miss Mitchell, perhaps you should accompany Jake. If there are injuries, having someone with your knowledge might be crucial. Panic prickled at the edges of Sarah's calm. The last thing she wanted was to leave town with a man already suspicious of her past. But to decline now would raise more questions than it answered. I wouldn't want to intrude. You wouldn't be, Jake interrupted. His tone was polite, but firm. I'd appreciate the company. And if you're as capable as Dr. Carson believes, you could be a real asset. Emma was already moving, assembling supplies with efficient hands. It's a good idea. You'll both be safer this way, and it's a chance to see more of the territory. An hour later, Sarah found herself on horseback, riding a calm mare beside Jake Morgan as they headed toward Widow's Creek. The late morning sun warmed the trail, and the breeze carried scents of pine, wet earth, and wildflowers. Under different circumstances, the view might have brought her peace, but her focus was on the man beside her. Jake rode with the ease of someone who'd grown up on horseback, his posture relaxed but alert. He'd said little since leaving town. But Sarah felt his gaze drift her way more than once, as if he were putting together a puzzle with her at its center. Out of nowhere he spoke. Tell me about Boston. His voice was casual, but she sensed intent beneath the words. What? Would you like to know? You said you worked with a doctor who treated veterans. What kind of medicine was that? Sarah chose her words carefully, sticking as close to truth as possible while omitting dangerous details. Dr. Harrison specialized in treating soldiers who'd suffered injuries during the war. Many of them required ongoing surgical procedures to address complications from old wounds. Dr. Harrison, Jake repeated. Would that be Charles Harrison? He published several papers on battlefield surgery in the New England Journal of Medicine. The question caught Sarah off guard. She hadn't expected a cowboy in the Colorado Territory to be familiar with medical journals, much less specific physicians from Boston. You're familiar with his work? I read extensively, Jake replied. Medical knowledge interests me, particularly surgical techniques that can be applied in remote areas where professional help isn't readily available. They rode in silence for several minutes while Sarah processed this information. Jake Morgan was clearly more educated than his cowboy appearance suggested, and his knowledge of medical literature meant he might be able to verify or disprove details of her claimed background. Miss Mitchell, Jake said as they approached a narrow canyon that led toward Widow's Creek, I have a proposition for you. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, though she kept her expression neutral. What sort of proposition? Jake reined in his horse and turned to face her directly. His green eyes held an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. I think you're carrying burdens that are making you sick, and I think you're hiding truths that are eating at you from the inside. The words hit her like physical blows, but she managed to keep her voice steady. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you know exactly what I mean, Jake replied gently. I've seen that look before, in soldiers who'd witnessed too much, in women who'd lost everything they cared about. You're running from something, and it's poisoning you as surely as any bullet wound. Sarah's hands tightened on her reins, and she felt the familiar urge to flee that had driven her across 3 states. But something in Jake's voice kept her from spurring her horse away from this uncomfortable conversation. Here's my proposition, Jake continued. I can help heal whatever's hurting you physically and emotionally, but only if you're willing to tell me the truth about who you really are and what you're running from. I'll cure one if you'll tell the other. The words seemed to echo in the canyon air, carrying implications that Sarah wasn't ready to face. She stared at Jake Morgan, this man who seemed to see through her carefully constructed defenses as if they were made of glass, and wondered how her plan to disappear quietly into a small mountain town had led to this moment of reckoning. Before she could formulate a response, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed from the direction of Widow's Creek, followed immediately by the sound of men shouting. Jake's attention snapped toward the source of the commotion, his body tensing with readiness for action. "Sounds like our claim jumpers are still in residence," he said, checking his sidearm. "We'll continue our conversation later, Miss Mitchell. Right now, it appears we have more immediate concerns." As they urged their horses toward the sound of conflict, Sarah realized that her carefully planned new life in Cedar Falls was about to become far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The first test of her true identity was approaching, and she would soon discover whether Jake Morgan's proposition about healing and truth would prove to be salvation or destruction. The canyon narrowed as they approached Widow's Creek, with steep rock walls rising on either side and only a single trail leading to the disputed mining claims. Jake signaled for silence as they dismounted and secured their horses in a grove of aspens that would provide cover. The sound of voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, though the words were indistinct. Sarah checked the medical kit Emma had prepared, ensuring that all supplies were easily accessible. As she worked, she was aware of Jake watching her movements with the same careful attention he'd shown since their first meeting. His earlier proposition hung between them like a challenge, but immediate circumstances demanded their focus. "3 men definitely," Jake whispered, having crept forward to observe the mining camp. "They've set up a crude fortification using mining equipment and lumber. Professional enough to suggest this isn't their first claim jumping operation." Sarah nodded, though she was processing more than just the tactical situation. Jake's assessment was thorough and accurate, delivered with the confidence of someone experienced in evaluating potential conflicts. Another piece of evidence that the cowboy was more than he appeared to be. "Sheriff Bradley approached from the main trail," Jake continued. "They probably had a lookout posted who saw him coming. We'll need a different approach if we're going to avoid the same fate." The plan Jake outlined was simple but effective. Sarah would circle around to the north side of the camp, positioning herself where she could provide medical assistance, if needed, while staying out of the line of fire. Jake would approach from the south, using the mining equipment for cover as he attempted to negotiate the claim jumpers' surrender. "And if they refuse to surrender?" Sarah asked. Jake's expression hardened. "Then we'll deal with that situation as it develops. But I'd prefer to resolve this without additional bloodshed." As Sarah made her way through the rocky terrain toward her designated position, she found herself thinking about Jake's earlier proposition. His offer to help heal her in exchange for the truth about her identity demonstrated an understanding of human nature that went beyond casual observation. He'd recognized not just that she was hiding something, but that the weight of her secrets was causing genuine harm. The question was whether she could trust him with truths that had already cost her everything she'd once held dear. The photograph in her room showed 2 sisters who'd believed they could change the world through courage and compassion. One of those sisters was dead because of Sarah's choices, and the other was running from consequences that seemed to follow her no matter how far she traveled. From her position overlooking the mining camp, Sarah could see 3 men moving with the nervous energy of people who knew they were operating outside the law. Their leader was a heavy-set man with graying hair who carried himself with military bearing. The other 2 were younger, but they handled their weapons with familiarity that suggested extensive experience. Jake's approach was masterful in its simplicity. He moved from cover to cover with patience that would have impressed any military commander, taking time to assess each position before advancing. When he finally called out to the claim jumpers, his voice carried across the camp with calm authority. "This is Jake Morgan. I'm here to discuss the situation at Widow's Creek. Peacefully. No one needs to get hurt today. The response was immediate and violent. Rifle fire erupted from 3 different positions, sending bullets cracking against the rocks where Jake had taken cover. Sarah watched him return fire with careful precision. Each shot calculated to suppress rather than kill. The firefight continued for nearly 20 minutes, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Jake's marksmanship kept the claim jumpers pinned down, but their superior numbers and defensive positions prevented him from advancing. Sarah realized that the stalemate could continue indefinitely, with the constant risk that someone would be seriously wounded or killed. That's when she made a decision that would change everything about her carefully constructed new identity in Cedar Falls. Drawing on skills she'd hoped never to use again, Sarah began moving through the rocky terrain toward the claim jumper's position, using techniques learned during far more dangerous conflicts than a simple mining dispute. By the time Jake realized what she was doing, Sarah had already reached the perimeter of the claim jumper's defensive position. Her approach had been so silent and skillful that the men defending the camp had no idea they were about to be flanked by a woman they'd assumed was safely out of the conflict. The confrontation that followed would establish Sarah Mitchell as far more than a traveling seamstress, seeking quiet work in a mountain town. It would also prove to Jake Morgan that his instincts about her hidden identity had been more accurate than even he had suspected. Sarah moved through the rocky terrain with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to become invisible when survival demanded it. Each step was placed with deliberate care, avoiding loose stones that might betray her position. She had shed the careful posture of a traveling seamstress, her body now displaying the controlled movements of someone trained for situations far more dangerous than mining disputes. The youngest of the claim jumpers, a nervous boy who couldn't have been more than 19, was positioned at the eastern edge of their makeshift fortification. His attention was focused entirely on Jake's position, rifle barrel resting on a wooden crate as he waited for another target to present itself. He never heard Sarah's approach until her hand clamped over his mouth and the cold steel of his own knife pressed against his throat. "Drop the rifle quietly," she whispered, her voice carrying an authority that froze the young man's struggle. "Before it could begin, not if you understand." The boy nodded frantically, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Sarah could feel his heart hammering against her arm as she held him, but she also sensed his immediate compliance. This one wasn't a hardened criminal, just someone who'd made poor choices and found himself in over his head. "Good," Sarah continued in the same quiet tone. "Now we're going to walk away from your friends, and you're going to tell me exactly what brought you to Widow's Creek and how many more men are involved in this operation." As they moved carefully away from the fortification, Sarah processed the tactical situation with skills she'd hoped never to use again. The 2 remaining claim jumpers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, but their arrangement also created blind spots that could be exploited. More importantly, their leader's military bearing suggested professional training, which meant he would recognize the disadvantage of losing one of his men. Jake's rifle fire had stopped, and Sarah could hear the older man shouting instructions to his remaining companion. The absence of return fire from the eastern position would be noticed within minutes, and the leader would either attempt to investigate or assume his youngest member had been eliminated. "Please don't hurt me," the boy whispered when Sarah finally allowed him to speak. "I didn't want to shoot anyone. Mr. Garrett said we were just going to scare off any claim jumpers, not fight the law." "Garrett?" Sarah kept her voice low, but the name triggered recognition. She'd heard it before, in context that made her blood run cold. Daniel Garrett? Former Army sergeant with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw? The boy's eyes widened with surprise. "You know him?" Sarah did know him, though not by choice. Daniel Garrett had been involved in activities during the war that went far beyond legitimate military operations. If he was operating in Colorado territory, it meant Sarah's past was catching up with her faster than she'd anticipated. "Listen carefully," she told the boy. "Your life depends on doing exactly what I tell you. Garrett isn't here for mining claims. He's here for something else, probably someone else. When did you first meet him?" 3 weeks ago in Denver. He said he had work for men who weren't afraid of rough assignments. Paid us half up front, promised more when the job was finished. 3 weeks ago was exactly when Sarah had arrived in Cedar Falls. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Somehow, Garrett had tracked her to Colorado territory and was using the mining dispute as cover for whatever operation he was really planning. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Sarah's interrogation. Through the rocks, she could see Garrett himself moving carefully toward their position, his rifle ready and his scarred face set in grim determination. Behind him, his remaining companion provided cover, sweeping the area with systematic precision. Sarah made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Instead of trying to escape with her captive, she positioned the young man where Jake could see him and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the mining camp. "Mr. Garrett, this is Sarah Coleman. I believe you've been looking for May." The use of her real name sent shockwaves through the immediate area. Jake's position shifted as he tried to get a better view of the situation, and she could feel his intense scrutiny even from a distance. Garrett stopped moving entirely, his rifle lowering slightly as he processed the implications of her revelation. "Sarah Coleman," Garrett replied, his voice carrying satisfaction mixed with wariness. "The elusive nurse who disappeared from Philadelphia, with information that belongs to certain interested parties. You've led us quite a chase across 3 states. Us?" Sarah kept her tone conversational, though her mind was racing through tactical possibilities. "How many men did you bring to this mountain paradise, Daniel?" "Enough," Garrett answered. "Though I'm impressed by your resourcefulness, taking young Billy here was professionally done. I see your time in the underground hasn't diminished your skills." Jake's voice cut through the conversation with sharp authority. "This is still my jurisdiction, Garrett. Whatever business you have with Miss Coleman can be discussed after you surrender your weapons and submit to lawful arrest." Garrett's laugh carried no humor. "I'm afraid this situation transcends local law enforcement, Cowboy. Miss Coleman is wanted by federal authorities for theft of government documents and conspiracy to commit treason. My associates and I are here to ensure her safe return to Philadelphia for trial." The words hit Jake like physical blows, but Sarah could see him processing the information with the same methodical approach he'd shown during their entire acquaintance. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new edge that suggested depth she hadn't yet discovered. Federal authorities would have proper documentation and would coordinate with local law enforcement. Your methods suggest a more unofficial arrangement. "Very perceptive," Garrett acknowledged. "Miss Coleman's former associates are eager to recover certain information she acquired during her time with the Underground Railroad. Some matters are too sensitive for official channels." Sarah felt the familiar weight of old guilt settling on her shoulders. The information Garrett referenced could destroy lives and careers if it fell into the wrong hands, but it was also the only insurance she had against the people who'd killed her sister and destroyed her life in Philadelphia. The documents hidden in her suitcase represented both her greatest vulnerability and her only hope for eventual justice. "The boy doesn't need to be involved in this," Sarah called out, making her voice carry to both Garrett and Jake. "Let him go, and we can discuss terms for the information you want." "No terms," Garrett replied sharply. "You'll come with us willingly, or we'll take you by force. Either way, those documents will be recovered." Jake's response came not in words but in action. His rifle spoke with deadly precision, sending a bullet that shattered the wooden crate Garrett was using for cover. The message was clear. Surrender was not optional, and local law enforcement would not be intimidated by federal threats. The firefight that erupted made the earlier skirmish seem like a minor disagreement. Garrett and his companion were professional soldiers, and they responded to Jake's challenge with coordinated fire that demonstrated extensive combat experience. But Jake fought with a cold efficiency that surprised even Sarah, his marksmanship and tactical sense revealing military training of his own. Sarah found herself caught between multiple loyalties and dangers. She could use the chaos to escape, leaving both Jake and Garrett to resolve their conflict without her involvement. But doing so would abandon the young man she'd captured and potentially result in Jake's death when he faced overwhelming odds. The alternative was to reveal skills and knowledge that would expose her true identity to a man who'd already seen too much. The decision was made for her when Garrett's companion attempted to flank Jake's position using the same route Sarah had taken to reach the eastern fortification. From her concealed position, she could see the man moving with professional stealth toward a point where he would have a clear shot at Jake's back. What followed would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years to come, though the full truth would never be widely known. Sarah Coleman, the woman who'd arrived in town as a traveling seamstress, demonstrated combat skills that left no doubt about her true background. Her intervention was swift, silent, and utterly professional. When the dust settled, Garrett's companion was unconscious and disarmed. The young Clang jumper was unharmed but thoroughly shaken, and Daniel Garrett himself was staring down the barrel of Jake Morgan's rifle with no options left except surrender. "Federal authorities are not," Jake said as he secured Garrett's weapons. "You discharged firearms within my jurisdiction and threatened local citizens. That makes this my responsibility until proper documentation proves otherwise." Sarah emerged from her concealment with the unconscious man's rifle and ammunition, her movements displaying the controlled tension of someone prepared for continued conflict. When she looked at Jake, she saw acceptance rather than shock in his expression, as if her combat skills had confirmed suspicions he'd already formed. "Miss Coleman," Jake said formally, "I believe we need to have that conversation about healing and truth." "I believe we do," Sarah agreed, though her attention remained focused on Garrett. "But first, we need to deal with immediate problems. Daniel's presence here means others are coming, and they won't be as patient about negotiation." Garrett's scarred face twisted into something resembling a smile. "You're right about that, Sarah. My associates expected regular communication. When they don't hear from us by sunset, they'll assume the worst and respond accordingly." Jake looked from Garrett to Sarah, clearly recognizing that the situation extended far beyond a simple mining dispute. "How many others are we talking about?" "At least 6 more," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned knowledge. "Probably positioned between here and town to cut off escape routes. Daniel doesn't take chances when the stakes are this high." The implications hung in the mountain air like gathering storm clouds. Cedar Falls, which had seemed like a peaceful refuge just days earlier, was about to become a battlefield. The townspeople Sarah had begun to care about were in danger because of secrets she'd carried across 3 states, and the man who'd offered to heal her burdens was now threatened by the very past she'd tried to escape. Jake secured their prisoners with practiced efficiency, binding their hands and ensuring they couldn't interfere with whatever came next. As he worked, Sarah could see him processing the tactical situation with military precision, cataloging resources and calculating odds with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. "We have perhaps 3 hours before Garrett's associates realize something's wrong," Sarah said, checking the captured weapons and ammunition. "That gives us time to warn the town and prepare defenses, but we'll need help from people who know how to fight." "Cedar Falls has more veterans than you might expect," Jake replied. "The war left its mark on men who came west seeking new beginnings. Most would stand up to protect their community if they understood the stakes. Sarah nodded, though she was already thinking beyond immediate tactical concerns. The information hidden in her suitcase would eventually have to be dealt with, one way or another. The documents that had cost her sister's life and forced her into exile contained evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and industry. Keeping them secret protected guilty parties, but revealing them would put innocent people in danger. "Jake," she said as they prepared to return to town with their prisoners, "there are things about my past that you need to know before we face what's coming. Things that will help you understand why these men are willing to kill to recover what I'm carrying." Jake's green eyes met hers with steady intensity. "Then it's time for that conversation about truth and healing. But first, we get our people to safety." The ride back to Cedar Falls took on the character of a tactical withdrawal, with both Sarah and Jake constantly scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of additional threats. Garrett and his companion rode with their hands bound, their presence serving as insurance against immediate attack by any associates who might be watching from concealment. As they approached the outskirts of town, Sarah felt the weight of approaching confrontation settling around her like a familiar but unwelcome garment. The peaceful life she'd hoped to build in the mountain community was about to be shattered by the violent realities of her past. But for the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she wouldn't be facing those realities alone. Jake Morgan had proven himself to be far more than a cowboy with healing knowledge. His combat skills, tactical thinking, and immediate acceptance of her true nature suggested a man with his own hidden depths. The proposition he'd made about curing one secret, while she revealed another, had taken on new dimensions in light of the day's events. When they reached Cedar Falls, the town was buzzing with activity as news of Sheriff Bradley's condition and the morning's events spread through the community. Dr. Emma Carson met them at her office, her professional concern evident as she took in their grim expressions and bound prisoners. "What happened out there?" Emma asked, though her trained eye was already cataloging details that suggested the situation was far more serious than a simple claim-jumping operation. "We need to gather the town council and anyone with military experience," Jake replied. "Cedar Falls is about to face a threat that goes beyond normal law enforcement capabilities." Grace Thompson appeared as if summoned by the gravity in Jake's voice, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with immediate understanding. "How serious?" "Serious enough that we need to prepare defenses and consider evacuation for non-combatants," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that made Grace look at her with new recognition. "Then we'd better start immediately," Grace replied. "This town has faced challenges before, and we've learned to stand together when circumstances demand it." As word spread through Cedar Falls that danger was approaching, Sarah found herself at the center of preparations that would test everything she'd learned about community, trust, and the possibility of redemption. The secrets she'd carried in isolation were about to become shared burdens, and the healing Jake had offered would require more courage than she'd ever imagined. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. That would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Sarah knew that sunset would bring more than natural beauty to Cedar Falls. It would bring the reckoning she'd been running from since the night her sister died in the Philadelphia alley, killed by men who served interests larger than law or justice. The town that had offered her refuge was about to learn that some secrets carry prices that extend far beyond the people who keep them. But it was also about to discover that when good people stand together against darkness, even the most dangerous, truths can become sources of strength rather than destruction. The transformation of Cedar Falls from peaceful mountain town to fortress began within an hour of Jake and Sarah's return. Word traveled swiftly through established networks that connected every household, shop, and ranch in the valley. By late afternoon, men were arriving from surrounding homesteads with rifles and grim determination. while women organized supplies and prepared the church basement as a secure shelter for children and elderly residents. Sarah stood in Dr. Carson's office, finally opening her leather suitcase for the first time since arriving in town. The false bottom revealed not only the medical instruments and money Jake had suspected, but also a waterproof packet containing documents that represented 3 years of careful investigation into corruption networks that stretched from Philadelphia to Washington. Emma and Jake watched in silence as Sarah laid out evidence that could topple senators and destroy industrial fortunes. These papers document systematic theft of federal funds intended for war widows and orphans, Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Names, dates, bank transfers, personal correspondence between government officials and private contractors. My sister Margaret and I spent 2 years gathering this evidence through our work with charitable organizations. Jake examined one of the documents, his expression growing darker as he read. This shows diversion of medical supplies meant for veteran hospitals. Thousands of men suffered or died because these supplies were sold to private buyers instead. Margaret believed we could expose the corruption through legal channels. Sarah continued, her fingers tracing the edge of her sister's photograph. She arranged a meeting with a federal prosecutor who claimed he wanted to pursue justice. Instead, he betrayed us to the people we were investigating. Emma's medical training had taught her to recognize different types of pain, and she could see the deep ache of loss in Sarah's posture. Your sister was killed because of these documents? Shot down in an alley 3 blocks from the federal courthouse, made to look like a robbery gone wrong. I barely escaped with the evidence, and I've been running ever since. Sarah's voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to continue. The men who killed Margaret work for interests that have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. They won't stop coming until these documents are destroyed or everyone who's seen them is dead. Jake was studying a map of the surrounding territory, marking potential approach routes and defensive positions with the methodical precision of someone who understood military tactics. How many men are we likely to face? Daniel Garrett typically works with teams of 8 to 12, Sarah replied. All former military, all experienced in operations that require discretion and violence. They'll have superior weapons and professional training. But they don't know our territory, Jake pointed out. And they're not fighting for their homes and families. Grace Thompson entered the office carrying a detailed inventory of the town's defensive resources. Her efficiency in organizing resistance efforts suggested this wasn't her first experience with threats to the community's safety. We have 23 men with military experience, Grace reported. Ammunition supplies are adequate for a sustained defense, and we've identified 6 buildings that can serve as strong points. The church has been prepared to shelter non-combatants, with multiple escape routes planned if evacuation becomes necessary. Sarah marveled at the speed and thoroughness of Cedar Falls' transformation. In just a few hours, the peaceful town had become an organized military position, with civilians displaying skills and coordination that spoke of hidden depths beneath their quiet mountain existence. There's something else you should know, Jake said. His attention focused on one of the documents from Sarah's collection. This correspondence mentions railroad surveys through Colorado Territory. The corruption you documented isn't just about past theft, it's about future development plans that would affect this entire region. Sarah examined the papers Jake indicated, feeling a chill of recognition as she processed the implications. They're planning to use federal funds to survey railroad routes through mineral-rich areas, then buy up the land through shell companies before the surveys become public knowledge, including the area around Cedar Falls, Emma observed. Our mountain valley sits directly on one of the proposed routes. The revelation added new dimensions to their situation. Garrett and his associates weren't just pursuing Sarah to recover damaging evidence. They were also protecting a future scheme that could generate millions in illegal profits. The corruption network she'd exposed had evolved from wartime theft to peacetime exploitation on a massive scale. "This explains why they're willing to risk so much to stop you," Jake said. "You're not just threatening past crimes, you're jeopardizing future ones." Mayor Bob Wilson arrived with Sheriff Bradley, who insisted on participating despite his wounded shoulder. The sheriff's pale complexion and careful movements show he was still recovering, but his presence provided moral authority that strengthened the town's resolve. "We've sent riders to Pine Valley and Bear Canyon," Sheriff Bradley reported. "Allied communities will provide what assistance they can, but most help won't arrive until tomorrow morning." "We need to hold until dawn," Jake replied. "After that, we'll have enough support to either defeat Garrett's forces or negotiate from a position of strength." As evening approached, defensive positions were manned and final preparations completed. Sarah found herself assigned to Dr. Carson's office, which had been transformed into a field hospital with clear sight lines to multiple defensive physicians. Her medical knowledge would be crucial if the fighting resulted in casualties, but her strategic value also made her a primary target for any assault. Jake appeared in the doorway as she finished organizing medical supplies. His presence filled the small space with calm authority that reminded Sarah of the finest officers she'd worked with during the war. "How are you feeling about our chances?" he asked, settling into a chair where he could watch both Sarah and the street outside. "Professionally speaking, we have good defensive positions and motivated defenders," Sarah replied. "Personally, I'm terrified that my past is about to destroy people who've shown me more kindness in 3 days than I've experienced in 3 years. Jake studied her face in the lamplight, his green eyes reflecting understanding that went beyond casual sympathy. "You mentioned that your sister believed in justice through legal channels. What do you believe in?" The question struck deeper than Sarah had expected. During her months of running and hiding, she'd focused entirely on survival, setting aside larger questions about purpose and meaning. But Jake's inquiry forced her to confront what she'd lost beyond family and safety. "I used to believe in healing," she said slowly, "in using knowledge and skill to reduce suffering wherever I found it. But after Margaret's death, I've mostly believed in staying alive long enough to ensure her sacrifice meant something." "And now?" Sarah looked around the converted medical office, taking in the supplies gathered by a community preparing to defend itself, the determination visible in faces of people who'd welcomed a stranger, despite the danger she represented. "Now I'm beginning to remember why healing matters more than just survival." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see riders approaching from the east, moving with the cautious advance of people expecting trouble. Grace Thompson's voice carried clearly as she called out challenges and received responses that identified the newcomers as allies from neighboring settlements. The arriving reinforcements included Marshal Tom Stevens from Pine Valley, accompanied by 6 deputies and a wagon load of additional ammunition. Stevens was a weathered man in his 50s whose reputation for honest law enforcement had made him powerful enemies among corrupt territorial officials. "Miss Coleman," Stevens said when introductions were made, "I've heard about the documents you're carrying. Federal authorities have been making inquiries through unofficial channels, trying to locate you for several weeks." "What kind of inquiries?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that don't involve official warrants or proper procedures," Stevens replied grimly. "Someone with significant influence has been pressuring territorial marshals to provide assistance in your capture, but they've been careful to avoid creating official records." Jake and Sheriff Bradley exchanged meaningful glances. The corruption Sarah had documented clearly extended into law enforcement agencies, making it impossible to trust official channels for justice or protection. "How many federal marshals have been compromised?" Jake asked. "Unknown," Stevens admitted, "but enough to make any official resolution dangerous for Miss Coleman and anyone associated with her." As full darkness settled over Cedar Falls, The defenders took their positions with quiet efficiency. Sarah could see armed figures moving between buildings, establishing fields of fire and communication networks that would allow coordinated responses to any assault. The transformation from peaceful community to military organization was complete, but the real test was yet to come. The attack began just after midnight with a precision that confirmed Garrett's military background. Simultaneous explosions at 3 different locations sent shockwaves through the valley, designed to create confusion and draw defenders away from key positions. But instead of panicking, Cedar Falls responded with disciplined coordination that frustrated the attackers' initial strategy. Sarah watched from the medical office as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness around the town's perimeter. The sound of rifle fire echoed off mountain walls, creating a cacophony that made it difficult to determine the attackers' exact positions. But the defenders' response was measured and effective, with each strong point providing covering fire that prevented Garrett's forces from advancing. The first casualties arrived within minutes of the fighting's start. 2 townsmen with superficial wounds from flying debris, followed by a more serious case involving a rancher who'd taken a bullet through his upper arm. Sarah worked with Emma to treat the injuries, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the continuing sounds of battle outside. Jake appeared periodically to check on their situation and report on the fighting's progress. His calm demeanor provided reassurance even as he delivered sobering tactical assessments. "They're probing our defenses systematically," he reported during one brief visit. "Professional approach, looking for weak points rather than trying to overwhelm us with direct assault." "How long can we hold?" Emma asked while bandaging the rancher's wound. "Until dawn, certainly. After that, it depends on whether they're willing to escalate or negotiate." The battle continued through the night with neither side gaining decisive advantage. Garrett's forces demonstrated superior individual skills and equipment, but Cedar Falls defenders knew their terrain and fought with desperate determination. By sunrise, the attackers had been forced to withdraw to defensive positions of their own, creating a stalemate that favored the side with better supply lines and community support. Marshal Stevens coordinated the morning's activities, sending riders to request additional assistance from territorial authorities, while organizing patrols to monitor Garrett's positions. The corruption that Sarah had documented clearly influenced some federal agencies, but Stevens believed honest lawmen still outnumbered the compromised ones. "The key is getting this evidence to the right people," Stevens explained to Sarah and Jake. "Senator Morrison has been investigating territorial corruption for months. If we can get your documents to his committee, they'll have the authority and resources to pursue justice through proper channels." Sarah found herself torn between hope and skepticism. Her sister's faith in legal solutions had resulted in betrayal and death, but the alternative was continued running and hiding while guilty parties escaped consequences for their crimes. "Senator Morrison's committee has subpoena power and federal protection for witnesses," Stevens continued. "It's your best chance for both justice and safety." Jake studied the marshal with careful attention. "And our guarantee that Senator Morrison isn't compromised like other officials?" "No guarantees in this business," Stevens admitted. "But Morrison's record is clean, and he's already made enemies among the same interests that killed Miss Coleman's sister. The decision about trusting another government official would have to wait." Scouts reported that Garrett's forces were receiving reinforcements, with at least 12 additional men arriving from the direction of Denver. The corruption network was escalating their response, bringing resources that could overwhelm Cedar Falls' defenses despite the community's heroic resistance. "We need to break this stalemate before they bring in enough men to surround us completely," Jake observed. "Right now we still have escape routes and supply lines. That won't last if they continue building their forces." Sarah looked at the documents scattered across Dr. Carson's desk, evidence that represented years of dangerous investigation and her sister's sacrifice. The information could expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, but only if it survived the current crisis and reached officials willing to act on it. The choice she faced would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone in Cedar Falls who'd risked their lives to protect her. Trust and betrayal, justice and survival, healing and destruction, all hung in the balance as the mountain morning brought new challenges that would test everything. She'd learned about courage, community, and the true meaning of redemption. The solution came from an unexpected source. Charlie Davis, the young deputy who'd been helping coordinate communications between defensive positions, burst into the medical office with news that changed everything about their tactical situation. "There's a telegraph line," Charlie announced. Breathlessly, hidden line that runs through the old mining tunnels up to Copper Ridge. The original surveyors installed it for emergency communications, but most folks forgot about it when the main line came through town. Jake looked up from cleaning his rifle, immediate interest evident in his expression. "How secure is this line?" "Completely separate from the main territorial network," Charlie replied. "Connects directly to the Federal Telegraph Office in Denver, bypassing all local switchboards." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as the implications became clear. A secure communication line could allow them to contact Senator Morrison's committee directly, providing real-time transmission of the evidence she'd been carrying while avoiding the compromised territorial networks that had already betrayed her sister. "The tunnel entrance is concealed in the mountainside about 2 miles north of town," Charlie continued. "Garrett's men wouldn't know about it, and it's defensible if we need to hold the position while transmitting." Marshal Stevens appeared in the doorway, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand its significance. "How long would transmission take for documents of this complexity?" Sarah calculated quickly, considering the volume of evidence and the limitations of telegraph technology. 6 hours minimum, possibly 8 if we include all supporting documentation. "That's our answer," Jake declared with quiet finality. "We hold defensive positions here while a small team uses the hidden telegraph to transmit everything to Senator Morrison's committee." The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Sarah would accompany Jake and Marshal Stevens to the concealed telegraph station, carrying original documents and her personal testimony about the corruption network's activities. Meanwhile, Cedar Falls would maintain its defensive posture, creating the impression that Sarah remained in town while actually providing cover for the transmission operation. Grace Thompson coordinated the deception with characteristic efficiency, arranging for a woman of similar build to appear briefly at windows of the medical office while wearing Sarah's distinctive traveling dress. Dr. Carson prepared medical supplies for the mountain expedition, knowing that any injury during the mission could prove fatal without immediate treatment. The ascent to Copper Ridge began in the pre-dawn darkness, with Jake leading them through terrain he'd explored since childhood. The hidden path wound through dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent concealment but demanded careful navigation and limited visibility. Sarah found herself marveling at Jake's woodcraft skills, his ability to move silently through wilderness while maintaining tactical awareness of potential threats. The telegraph station proved to be more sophisticated than Charlie's description had suggested. The original mining surveyors had constructed a substantial facility with multiple communication lines and emergency power supplies that could operate independently for extended periods. The equipment was well maintained, suggesting someone had been responsible for its upkeep despite its official abandonment. "My grandfather helped build this place," Jake explained as he activated the power systems. "Family's been maintaining it ever since, just in case the town ever needed emergency communications." Sarah began organizing documents in order of importance, prioritizing evidence that would be most devastating to the corruption network if it reached Senator Morrison's committee. The systematic nature of the theft she'd documented became even clearer as she arranged the materials chronologically. revealing a pattern of escalating criminality that spanned nearly a decade. Marshal Stevens established communication with Denver, using federal codes that would ensure their transmission reached the appropriate authorities without interception by compromised local networks. The initial responses confirmed that Senator Morrison's committee was actively investigating territorial corruption and had been expecting contact from Sarah Coleman. The transmission process proved both tedious and nerve-wracking. Each document had to be converted to telegraph format, transmitted in segments, and confirmed for accuracy before proceeding to the next item. Sarah found herself reliving the investigation that had consumed 3 years of her life and ultimately cost her sister's life. But for the first time since Margaret's death, she felt hope that justice might actually be possible. Jake maintained watch on the mountain approaches while monitoring radio communications from Cedar Falls. The reports indicated that Garrett's forces had indeed received substantial reinforcements, but remained focused on the town itself, apparently unaware that their primary target had escaped to pursue alternative strategies. Transmission is proceeding faster than expected, Marshal Stevens reported during a brief break. Senator Morrison's staff is standing by to receive additional documentation, and they've already begun preliminary verification of the evidence we've sent. Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The corruption network that had seemed invincible just days earlier was about to face federal investigation by officials with both the authority and motivation to pursue justice. But she also knew that powerful interests wouldn't surrender without escalating their response to dangerous levels. Her concerns proved justified when Jake detected movement on the lower mountain slopes. Through his field glasses, he could see at least 6 men advancing toward the telegraph station's general location, moving with the systematic search pattern of professional trackers. "They've discovered our absence from town," Jake reported grimly, "probably through surveillance we didn't detect." The remainder of the transmission would have to be completed under siege conditions. Sarah worked with desperate efficiency to convert the most critical documents while Jake and Marshal Stevens prepared defensive positions around the telegraph station. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again placing others in mortal danger because of the evidence she carried. The attack on the telegraph station displayed the same professional competence as the assault on Cedar Falls, but with greater urgency. Garrett's forces couldn't afford to allow the transmission to continue, even if stopping it required tactics that would attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Rifle fire echoed off the mountain walls as the defenders fought to protect both the telegraph equipment and Sarah's ability to complete her work. Jake's marksmanship proved devastating in the confined terrain, where his knowledge of local geography gave him significant advantages over attackers who were operating in unfamiliar territory. Marshal Stevens coordinated their defense while maintaining communication with both Denver and Cedar Falls, ensuring that multiple agencies were aware of the situation and could respond appropriately if the transmission was interrupted. His experience with territorial law enforcement provided strategic insights that helped counter Garrett's tactical advantages. The final documents were transmitted just as ammunition began running low and Garrett's forces prepared for a direct assault on the telegraph station. Sarah's hands shook with exhaustion and adrenaline as she sent confirmation codes that verified the complete transmission of evidence to Senator Morrison's committee. "It's done," she announced, her voice barely audible above the continuing gunfire. "Everything's been transmitted and confirmed received." Jake's relief was evident despite their continued tactical situation. "Then we've accomplished what we came here to do. Now we just need to survive long enough to see justice carried out." The resolution came with startling suddenness. Federal marshals arriving from Denver surrounded Garrett's position just as his forces prepared their final assault, creating a crossfire that left the corruption network's enforcers with no viable options except surrender. Senator Morrison's committee had acted with impressive speed. using the transmitted evidence to obtain arrest warrants and coordinate with honest law enforcement agencies. Daniel Garrett's capture marked the beginning of investigations that would eventually expose corruption, reaching into multiple government departments and dozens of private companies. The evidence Sarah had preserved at such personal cost became the foundation for prosecutions that recovered millions in stolen funds and resulted in significant reforms to federal contracting procedures. But perhaps more importantly for Sarah, the successful transmission represented closure on the guilt and grief that had consumed her since Margaret's death. Her sister's sacrifice had meaning beyond personal loss, contributing to justice that would prevent future victims from suffering similar betrayals. The descent from Copper Ridge took them through terrain painted gold by autumn sunshine, with clear mountain air that seemed to wash away the tension and fear of recent days. Cedar Falls spread below them like a living map, showing a community that had proven itself capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. Jake walked beside Sarah with the easy stride of someone completely comfortable in wilderness settings. Their shared experience had created bonds that went beyond the attraction she'd felt since their first meeting, establishing foundation for something deeper and more lasting than either had expected to find. "So," Jake said as they approached the town's outskirts, "I believe I made you a proposition about curing one secret if you'd tell another." Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years, despite the physical exhaustion of recent events. "You did indeed. And I believe I've fulfilled my part of the bargain rather thoroughly." "More thoroughly than I expected," Jake agreed. "Which means I owe you healing of a rather substantial nature." "What kind of healing did you have in mind?" Jake paused in his walking, turning to face her with an expression that combined serious intent with gentle humor. "The kind that involves building a life worth living instead of just surviving day to day. The kind that comes from belonging somewhere and contributing to something larger than yourself." Sarah looked toward Cedar Falls, seeing not just a refuge from her past but a genuine future that could include purpose, community, and the possibility of happiness she'd thought lost forever. The town had earned her loyalty through its willingness to risk everything for a stranger, and she'd discovered that healing others could indeed heal the healer. "I accept your prescription, Dr. Morgan," she replied formally, then smiled at the title she'd given him. "Though I suspect the treatment will require extended residence in this particular mountain community." "Probably years," Jake agreed with mock seriousness. "The condition you're treating is chronic and requires sustained attention." 6 months later, Sarah Coleman Morgan stood in the expanded medical office that served Cedar Falls and surrounding communities, reviewing patient records with Dr. Emma Carson and planning treatment schedules that utilized both formal medical training and traditional healing methods Jake had learned from his Cherokee grandmother. The corruption prosecutions had resulted in congressional reforms and significant financial recovery for defrauded programs. But the personal justice Sarah treasured most was the simple ability to practice healing without fear or concealment. Margaret's photograph occupied a place of honor on the office desk, surrounded by evidence of lives saved and community strengthened through honest medical care. Jake appeared in the doorway carrying their infant son, whose arrival had surprised everyone, including his parents, with its perfect timing, just as spring returned to the mountain valley. The baby's presence seemed to complete something that Sarah hadn't realized was missing, providing hope for the future that transcended past losses. "Patients are asking when you'll resume full schedules," Jake reported, settling into the chair beside her desk. "Apparently, traditional healing methods work better when administered by someone who understands both ancient wisdom and modern medicine." Sarah reached for her son, marveling as always at the small miracle of new life created from love rather than loss. "Tell them 2 more weeks. I need time to finish training the new assistants, and I want to establish proper procedures for the expanded clinic." The expanded clinic represented more than improved medical facilities. It symbolized Cedar Falls' transformation from isolated mountain town to regional center for innovation that combined traditional knowledge with modern techniques. The success attracted attention from medical schools and government agencies interested in rural healthcare models that achieved exceptional results through community cooperation. There's been another request for you to testify before congressional committees. Jake mentioned reviewing correspondence that had arrived on the morning stage. Senator Morrison wants your input on legislation that would protect witnesses who expose government corruption. Sarah considered the request while watching her son discover the fascinating complexity of his own fingers. Public testimony would require travel to Washington and renewed attention from interests that preferred to keep their activities secret. But it would also contribute to reforms that could prevent future victims from suffering what she and Margaret had endured. I'll go, she decided, but only if you and the baby come with me. I've learned that healing requires community, and my community includes both of you. Jake's smile reflected understanding that went beyond words. The proposition he'd made about curing one secret while revealing another had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated when they first met. Healing had indeed proved to be mutual, creating strength that multiplied when shared rather than diminished. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Sarah and Jake walked through streets that showed evidence of prosperity built on honest foundations. The railroad had indeed come through the valley, but under federal oversight that prevented the corruption originally planned. The community benefited from improved transportation and communication while maintaining the values that made it worth protecting. The mountains surrounding their valley caught the last light of sunset, painting peaks in shades that reminded Sarah of hope rather than loss. She'd learned that running from the past only postponed healing, while facing truth with courage could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. Her suitcase still sat in the bedroom they shared, but it no longer contained secrets or fears. Instead, it held mementos of their life together, letters from patients expressing gratitude, photographs of community celebrations, and plans for medical innovations that would serve future generations. The woman who'd arrived in Cedar Falls carrying nothing but guilt and grief had become someone who contributed healing and hope to everyone around her. The cowboy who'd offered to cure one secret while learning another had proved that the most powerful medicine was indeed love freely given and honestly received. Their story would be told in the valley for generations to come, not as legend but as proof that even the most damaged hearts could find healing when surrounded by community, willing to share both burdens and joys. The secret Sarah had carried across 3 states had become the foundation for justice that protected countless others, while the cure Jake had offered had evolved into a lifetime commitment to healing that extended far beyond individual treatment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.